Good afternoon, everyone. We're here today joined by the Office of Management and Budget to talk about the proposed budget for 2022-23 and the summary section. I'm going to turn it over to Councilmember Gruber, the Finance Chair, to lead us off.
Thank you, President Melendez. Good afternoon, everybody. I just wanted to remind folks that we have our budget hearings this upcoming Monday and Tuesday. Full days. They will be televised, they'll be recorded, they will be shared. There's lots of information that we can hopefully Katie and James put on our Facebook page and every other communication about how folks can lean into that. This section today is being led by Director Mike Burns and OMB around specifically the summary section of the proposed budget, and looking forward to it. So without further ado, I'll pass it over to Director Burns.
Sounds good. Thanks, Councilmember Gruber, and thanks to everybody for joining us this afternoon. Pleased to be able to lead you through this work session. We figured that you've not had your fill of budget material, so we would provide some additional material. But in all seriousness, if you're not already, you soon will be deep into your reviews of the proposed 2022-23 budget in advance of the hearings next week, which we are looking forward to. And so the timing is good to give you an overview of a section that you probably won't spend most of your time on. You know, I think looking through each of the departments is kind of the view on the ground of the proposed budget, department by department. The summary section, I like to call it the view from the hilltop. It kind of brings everything into perspective, kind of gives you context of what the whole budget looks like in the aggregate, not just from an expenditure standpoint, which certainly is something that we focus on, but also from a revenue standpoint too. So I know for me, it's a section that provides great perspective, and I hope that it will do the same for you. Joining me this afternoon for our overview is Suzanne Warren, our Assistant Director, and also Emily Lohner is with us, our Senior Management Analyst. So without further ado, if we could go to the next slide. And after that. So we're going to take you through a few slides on concepts and fund accounting, which I know everybody loves. Then we will get into the key aspects of the summary section. And Suzanne will take you through some of those as well. And then there will be time for questions at the end. Happy to take as much time as we need. We're scheduled for an hour, but if we run less than that, I'm sure everyone will be okay with that too. So just some basics here from a guiding principles perspective. By state law and city charter, we do have to present a balanced budget, and we've certainly done that with the proposed 2022-23 budget. Making up the budget, expenditures, the outlays that support programs, services, and paying employees. Budget consists of revenues, inflow that funds all of those things, whether it be from taxes, user fees, operating assistance, and other sources. One of the challenges as a city government, similar to what all local governments face, we're limited in how much we can raise from a revenue standpoint, and yet balanced budget does require sufficient revenue. So next slide. Our budgets are organized by funds. The city budget is, and all other local governments. Some funds are required by state law. We do get some discretion in other special purpose funds that we might create. And there are two sources of funds, primary categories, I should say. One, true to its name, is tax supported, and the other is self-supported, meaning that any fees it generates should support the expenditures out of that fund. All of our funds relative to the summary section are listed on page 1-45 and 1-46. So you can check that out as you're reviewing that section. So we're looking here at tax supported funds. And I think when most of us think of any fund inside of city government, we think of the general fund. And that in fact is our most significant fund from an expenditure standpoint, and it's also our most significant from a tax-supported standpoint. Flowing through there would be all the revenue we get from property tax, sales tax, any of our operating assistance from the state, our AIM aid, as well as any federal funding that we receive, most notably being our ARPA dollars that we've been talking quite a bit about lately. Tax supported funds, the outlays, basically all of our operating expenses, as well as our cash capital and our debt service. And then tax supported, not only the general fund, but all of our enterprise funds, including animal control, library, war memorial, parking, and a number of others, again, listed on pages 1-45 and 46. Suzanne, I'll let you take this one.
Thanks, Mike. So you'll see this is a really simplistic example of balancing a tax-supported fund. And I have to admit, one of my favorite pages in the budget document is the fund summary, which is reflected on 1-46. It's often overlooked, but it gives the big picture of expense and revenue for all the funds. So for a tax-supported fund, they have similar components to all the other funds, although you will notice on our fund summary, things like the fund animal service has no debt service, and the undistributed portion allocated to War Memorial has very little budget assigned to it because it has no employees. So from the expenditure side, we start with what the expected expense is for that fund and estimate what the revenue will be from different user fees. So it could be anything from library room charge to late fees for library books, things of that nature, paying for dog licenses. We take that revenue, what we expect it to be, and any other aid that might come in. The library does get a small amount of state aid, and whatever is left over after counting that revenue is the balance required from property taxes. So that differs for each fund. And we try to explain in the summary section in pages 1-13 through 1-16 when there's a fluctuation in how much each fund requires in property taxes on a year-to-year basis. I'll turn it back over to you, Mike.
Great. So actually, I think you're going to take this one on self-supported.
That is me. Sorry. For the true enterprise funds, these technically are supposed to operate like self-contained businesses. So we undertake a similar process. You can advance to the next slide. We determine what the actual expenditures or expected expenditures will be for the fund. We determine what the major user fees are, our revenue will be based on the rates that are currently in effect. And we undertake a similar process to determine what is left over that we either need to fund through fee increases or using fund balance or a combination of both. We do try to plan ahead so that the fees are not fluctuating. If refuse needs to buy a whole bunch of refuse trucks, we try not to budget that in 1 year, which could spike the rate. So on occasion, we will budget for lower expenditures and higher revenues, which leads to an in lieu of depreciation being budgeted. And in the environmental services chapter, you'll see the in lieu of depreciation goes away this year. If you have any questions about that, we can discuss that during the DES hearing on Monday.
Great, thanks, Suzanne. So giving you a little bit of background on fund accounting, some guiding principles around the budget. So now into the contents of the actual summary section. So starting off is the revenue summary, which has 3 categories. First of which is the summary of revenue changes. And you can see in the graphic that's up that shows budget to budget revenue at a line item level for the general fund and then at a summary level for all other funds. And again, you'll find that on page 1-3 inside of the summary chapter. Then we get into revenue estimates, and that provides a description of each revenue category along with commentary on the year-over-year change and any underlying assumptions used to develop that revenue estimate. So here we see up property tax, but if you were to go on in the section, you'd see a similar write-up on sales tax and all of the other revenue estimates that we have throughout the budget. And that runs from pages 1-4 to 1-22. And I'll let you take this one, Suzanne.
So the first calculation, which we just brought to you in the May council meeting, is the adjustment to the tax shift. So I think you saw there was a little bit of a shift over towards the homeowner side and away from the business or non-homestead side. We then partner that with any new tax roll assessment values, which luckily we are, really benefiting on that side, that our assessment values are going up. That has actually lowered the tax rates for both homestead and non-homestead. And I just want to make sure you know too, that a lot of times, even though we present the tax rates here, there are many homeowners that benefit from the STAR credit or exemption, a lot of which ultimately eliminate any property tax from like a senior's property tax bill. And what they're left with is just the embellishments, which would be refuse, local works, and any other special district charges. And back to you.
Great. So we've talked a little bit about revenue and how that lays out in the summary section. So it seems fitting that we then talk about expenditures. So the expenditure summary section summarizes expenditures in 4 ways. The first of which is a summary by department. So you can see budget to budget, how each department fluctuated and get a good context there. And that runs pages 1-34 through 1-37. Another meaningful look at expenditures across all of city government, and that's by major object. So for example, personnel expenses, materials and supplies. So another way to kind of look at, get a glance of budget to budget and actual as well.
Section 3-10 of the city charter actually requires that we provide this information in the budget, and it is a summary of all the amendments that are made to the 21-22 budget so that you can balance back to what we present in the amended budget column for 21-22 compared to the previously adopted budget. Okay. On page 1-44, and I know some council members have inquired about this information before, we do try to take, it's not an exact science, but we take all the expenses, try to break them out by department. So if there's cash capital that is assigned to Rec and Human Services, we will assign that in this chart. And then we try to take applicable revenue that goes with that department and deduct that from all the expenditures so that you can see the balance that is required from property tax or other fees. A good example would be emergency communications, to which is primarily supported on the operation side by the county. So the balance that is in the last column on this page would be what the city's responsibility is towards that center and operating the facility. I know there's oftentimes a lot of questions about this, so if you ever have any questions, please let us know. And that's it.
Great. So talked about the revenue summary, talked about the expenditure summary. The summary section also includes our multi-year projections. So when we talk about in the release of the proposed budget, for example, the gap that we had to close at the beginning of the budget process, it would be the all funds gap. And then, we provide the detail in this year as an attachment to the mayor's message as to how we do that. So, this is kind of a meaningful chart to look out at. And you can see that the gap grows into the out years. And that's what we're seeing here in the 2022-23 budget. The projection is actually pretty similar to the 5-year lookout that we saw in last year's 21 and 22 budget. And this section runs from pages 1-47 to 1-51. So we show projected budget gaps. We show the assumptions that are in the multi-year projection too. And I would say, the way that I would best characterize these are that, especially in the out years, if only we had a reliable glimpse into the future, a crystal ball of some kind, perhaps, we could have, more realistic assumptions. But in lieu of that, we're pretty conservative on the revenue side. And, you can see here the snippet that's up and throughout this section, it breaks down what the assumptions are in the multi-year from both revenue standpoint as well as an expenditure standpoint. And then lastly, the multi-year section of the summary just goes through, what might be some typical gap closure options that we would have available to us if we needed to use those.
Mike, is that best practice to have that in municipal budgets? Mike and Susanna, is that the idea of the projected budget gaps? Is that something you see in most city budgets, and does ours track in terms of kind of percentage of gap to overall budget?
Yeah, I would say from a presentation standpoint, what we're doing is consistent with what I've seen, certainly in well laid out city budgets. I'm not going to say that everybody does it, but in fact, I think it's transparent. It's reminding people that, each year brings its own unique set of challenges, and that, we really do always have a road ahead of us in terms of each year and trying to, close gaps. And I think our, again, I mentioned what you see here for us has been pretty consistent over the years. And I don't know, Suzanne, if you have anything to add to that.
The only thing I was going to say is this is also a required portion of the budget according to what is laid out in the city charter. Yep, section 3-10 there. And it definitely helps us to see how things will fluctuate. Like I said before, too, it helps us to see things that may be going on in the enterprise funds. Like if refuse 3 years from now needs to replace $3 million worth of vehicles, we're trying to plan ahead for things like that.
Yeah, and I think it also provides context around, let's assume that our fund balance is, closer to $100 million than not. You can look at the general fund gap and see, how many years worth of fund balance that we have. So on one hand, it's great to have fund balance. On the other hand, it's certainly something that we do not take for granted.
Thanks.
Yeah, so I think, again, wanted to present this because it does provide context. I think it really nicely wraps together all of what you're looking at and spending your time on in your reviews and what we'll be focused on, Monday and Tuesday of next week. It kind of wraps it up all neatly. And I know for us is a helpful section to keep things in perspective. And hopefully that the same can be said for all of you as well. So with that, happy to answer any questions that you have on this section.
Director Burns, just not necessarily a question on this section, I think, but overall, when we look at our projected issues moving forward in terms of the gap, I think the question is, when we look at this gap moving forward, equity and state aid is something that keeps coming up in conversations here amongst the council. You know, we don't get our fair share as compared to Syracuse or Buffalo. And I'm wondering if this council, this body should be more proactive in that regard. But just a question about that from an administrative perspective, on the administration side, what kind of conversations are happening around that between administration and state?
Yeah, so I appreciate the question, President Melendez. I think, you know, I'll leave it to council in terms of, you know, your level of advocacy on this issue, but obviously, you know, it's significant, right? So, you know, if you think of, you know, if you just look at the general fund gap, for example, in the out years, and, you know, state aid were to go up $20 million or $30 million, you can see what that does in the context of the general fund gap. So, you know, I think our state delegation has advocated for that. Those conversations continue. We're grateful for their advocacy, but, you know, that would certainly getting you know, our state aid on par with others would be significant, you know, in terms of the financial impact that would have for us. And especially if we think of, you know, even the 26 million in ARPA expenses, ARPA funded expenses that we have in this year's budget. You know, as you all know, that funding is not permanent. So, you know, what happens when some of the good work that's been started with that, you know, we get to the end of the funding cycle. So I think it's, you know, it's more critical now than ever to keep, you know, the notion of our fair share at the forefront.
I just want to note that if there are no other questions right now, obviously we will find time and opportunity to incorporate any questions on this section in the review process or in the hearing process. Probably the best time to do that would be during the administration's section that includes OMB, which is early on day one, I believe. So yep. This is not the only time to be able to ask questions here, but I certainly appreciate the opportunity to have a breakdown like this, Mike and Suzanne. Very helpful.
Well, great. You know, we appreciate the opportunity. We know you're all busy and, you know, in the midst of budget review and other things, but felt like this was important. It's a section that doesn't get always the most attention, but it is a pretty meaningful one in terms of the budget book. So thanks for the opportunity.
Great. If there's no other questions, you know, we really appreciate you going over the overview here today. I'm sure as we get into the budget season further next week, we'll have 1,000,001 questions coming up, but this was very helpful to get the summary level, high level information. Thank you. And thanks to your team for all the hard work preparing the budget this year. We look forward to asking our questions and dissecting it further in the next couple of weeks, but we do appreciate your time and energy.
Great. Thanks, President.